Hello, friends. Welcome to Soft History Stories. Imagine, for a moment, walking the foggy streets of Victorian London. The gaslights flicker dimly through the haze, casting long shadows as carriages rattle over cobblestone streets. There's a bustle in the air, but something feels off, something hidden beneath the surface of all this grandeur and bustling life. The city is full of contrasts. At one end, towering mansions where the wealthy enjoy fine meals and elegant entertainment. At the other, the grimy slums, where the working poor struggle to survive. But today, we're not diving into the well-known tales of opulence and despair. No, today, we're going to look at something far stranger and darker, something lurking beneath the polished facade of respectability. A hidden epidemic that quietly tore through Victorian society, a crisis of addiction that was conveniently ignored or downplayed, all in the name of maintaining a perfect image. I'm talking about the opium epidemic that gripped Victorian London. Opium was widely available, consumed as casually as any medicine today, and even prescribed for everything from headaches to insomnia. But what people didn't know, or perhaps what they chose to ignore, was the devastating toll it would take on individuals, families, and society as a whole. So, as we step into the hidden corners of history, where opium addiction fueled silent tragedies, let's take a moment to consider this strange and fascinating tale. Before we begin, if you're intrigued by this story, don't forget to like, share, and comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this twisted chapter of Victorian life. And of course, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one, where we dive deep into history's most bizarre, fascinating, and often tragic events. Now, let's take a step back in time and uncover the forgotten epidemic that existed behind the closed doors of Victorian society. Opium's role in Victorian society. Victorian London, with its thick fogs and pervasive smog, was a city of sharp contrasts, where grandiose affluence met the harsh realities of poverty. The streets gleamed with the elegance of the upper class, their impeccable dress and towering carriages gliding over cobblestones as they went about their business in the city's glittering shopping districts. Yet, just steps away from their gilded world, in the alleyways and slums, the working poor toiled in unspeakable conditions, barely scraping by in overcrowded and dilapidated neighborhoods. The bustle of the markets and the clamor of workers' voices filled the air, juxtaposed with the quiet, elegant moments of aristocratic life. The fog that rolled in from the Thames seemed to cover everything, blurring the lines between the two worlds, as if Victorian society itself was wrapped in an ever-present veil, both literally and figuratively. At the heart of this complex and often contradictory world, respectability was the cornerstone of society. Image was everything, particularly for the upper echelons of Victorian London. The pursuit of reputation, being perceived as morally upright, pious, and virtuous, was the driving force behind the behavior of the upper class. Everything they did was scrutinized, from their manners and speech to their clothing and social gatherings. To be seen as respectable was to belong to the highest tier of society, while even the slightest deviation from the expected norms could ruin a person's reputation and social standing. In this strict social climate, the rules governing behavior were clear, but the pressures that accompanied those rules could be crushing, especially for women. It was against this backdrop of rigid propriety that opium found its place in Victorian society. For many, it was a medical marvel, a cure-all for ailments both physical and mental. But what most did not realize, or chose to ignore, was that opium's seductive allure was as dangerous as it was pervasive. It was a paradox. On one hand, opium was readily available, prescribed by doctors and sold openly in pharmacies, seen as a legitimate remedy for many common ailments. On the other, its addictive properties were largely downplayed, if not entirely overlooked, especially by the upper classes. the drug's social acceptability and medicinal endorsement obscured its devastating effects, and its role in Victorian society was far more insidious than many could have imagined. Opium, in its many forms, became woven into the fabric of Victorian life, especially for women. In an era when women were expected to maintain an image of perfection, quiet, composed, and devoted to their husbands and families, the pressure could be overwhelming. The constant demands of domestic life, combined with limited opportunities for personal fulfillment, left many women feeling helpless, anxious, and trapped in a world that dictated every aspect of their lives. Doctors, seen as the guardians of respectability, were all too eager to offer a remedy: opium. One of the most common forms of opium was laudanum, a tincture made from opium and alcohol. It was prescribed for an array of conditions from insomnia and anxiety to menstrual cramps and general nervousness. The Victorian understanding of these conditions, particularly in women, was vague at best, often lumping together a variety of symptoms under the umbrella of female maladies. And opium was seen as a solution to them all. Laudanum became widely accepted as a safe and effective treatment. For many women, it was a way to cope with the pressures of Victorian society. They could take a spoonful of the tincture, slip into a state of calm, and continue to fulfill their roles as dutiful wives and mothers, all the while quietly suppressing the emotional and physical strains of their lives. In this way, opium offered a temporary escape, a brief respite from the overwhelming expectations placed on women to be perfect, selfless, and composed at all times. But as the years went on, something far darker began to emerge. What began as a cure for nervous disorders quickly became a dependency. For women, this dependency was not just about the drug's physical effects, but also about the social pressures that guided their lives. Women were expected to maintain an air of decorum and refinement, and the use of opium fit neatly into this framework. It was socially acceptable for women to take medicine, especially when prescribed by doctors, and this made the addiction even harder to recognize. If a woman showed signs of addiction, she was often excused as merely needing more rest, or perhaps simply suffering from the stress of her duties. The stigma of addiction, especially in women, was rarely considered, and when it was often dismissed or ignored altogether. The widespread availability of opium, paired with the cultural climate that emphasized the importance of maintaining a pristine reputation, led to an epidemic that was largely invisible. Opium addiction, once considered a legitimate form of medical treatment, had now become a pervasive issue, particularly among the upper class. Doctors continued to prescribe opium, often unaware or indifferent to the damage it was causing. For women, in particular, this was a quiet tragedy, a cycle of dependency that was never fully acknowledged, but that had devastating consequences for countless individuals and families. Meanwhile, the opium trade itself, particularly through the East India Company, played a significant role in making opium a commodity in Victorian Britain. The East India Company, as part of its colonial ventures, had established a thriving trade in opium, which it produced in India and then sold in China, eventually flooding the market in Britain. The British Empire's exploitation of its colonies had far-reaching consequences, and the opium trade became a symbol of the colonial mindset that defined much of Victorian life. Opium was not just a medicine, it was also an economic powerhouse, a product that generated immense wealth and fueled imperial ambitions. This connection between the drug trade and imperialism was far from incidental. It was integral to the way Britain operated in the world. In this sense, opium also became a symbol of the contradictions at the heart of Victorian society. While Britain presented itself as a bastion of moral and social order, it was simultaneously profiting from the very vices it condemned. Opium addiction was seen as a personal failing in many respects. But the reality was that it was often a byproduct of a society that valued wealth and status above all else. For women, opium represented both an escape and a trap, offering temporary relief from the stress and strain of their roles in society. But at the cost of their physical and mental health, this was not an isolated issue. Opium was a hidden epidemic, one that affected all layers of society, but especially those who were expected to uphold the ideals of Victorian respectability. Women, particularly in the upper classes, were often the ones most affected by this duality, their addiction masked by their social status, their struggles buried beneath layers of politeness and propriety. And yet, as we continue to look deeper into the effects of opium on Victorian society, we will see that its grip reached beyond just the medical field, influencing not only personal lives, but the very fabric of British culture and politics. This hidden epidemic is one that, in many ways, still echoes through history, and its consequences are far from over. Women and opium, the hidden crisis. In Victorian London, where the fog of industrial revolution mingled with the smog of societal expectations, women were often seen as delicate creatures, emotionally fragile, and in need of constant care. This perception of womanhood as an inherently weaker sex was deeply ingrained in the fabric of society. Women were expected to maintain an air of perfection, calm, collected, and demure. But in the suffocating confines of this ideal, they were also suffering in silence. The pressures of living up to these expectations took a physical and emotional toll, and the very society that dictated their behavior also provided the means for their escape. Opium. Opium had long been used in medical treatments across the world, but in Victorian England, its use escalated dramatically. For many people, especially women, it became the panacea for a wide range of ailments. Doctors readily prescribed laudanum, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, for everything from anxiety and depression to insomnia and menstrual pain. These were considered common complaints for women at the time, as their emotional and physical states were often viewed as unstable or inherently frail. It was not uncommon for a woman to seek medical relief from such symptoms, and it was equally common for doctors to reach for the opium bottle as a solution. For Victorian women, life was often characterized by a sense of powerlessness. Their roles were clearly defined. They were wives, mothers, and caretakers, tasked with managing the home and ensuring their families adhered to the rigid standards of propriety. Yet, despite this societal ideal of domestic bliss, many women found themselves trapped in a world of loneliness, frustration, and mental strain. The pressures to be perfect, to maintain their place in a society that was quick to judge, weighed heavily. And so, when doctors began to prescribe laudanum as a remedy for ailments that many felt were tied to the stresses of daily life, nervous disorders, depression, fatigue, it was readily accepted. It seemed like a medical miracle, a cure-all that promised relief from the anxiety and pressures that many women experienced. However, what was presented as a cure was, in reality, a dangerous and addictive substance. Opium, in its many forms, provided relief, temporary relief, that is, by dulling the senses and numbing the body. It could make a woman forget the burdens of her life, even if only for a few hours. Laudanum, particularly, was marketed as a solution to female frailties. It was considered acceptable for women to indulge in it because it was deemed to be a remedy for their supposed fragility. A woman with the vapors, a term used to describe a wide range of emotional or physical symptoms, was simply given laudanum to calm her nerves, often without any consideration for the consequences of long-term use. The problem, of course, was that laudanum, like any opiate, was highly addictive. The cycle of dependence started innocuously enough. Women were prescribed it to relieve anxiety, menstrual pain, or sleeplessness. And for a time, it worked. It soothed their bodies, calmed their nerves, and allowed them to continue fulfilling the roles society had defined for them. But soon, their bodies began to crave more. The dependency grew, and the very medicine that was supposed to provide relief became the source of their suffering. The addiction was subtle at first. Women often didn't even realize they were becoming dependent. What began as an occasional dose to help with a sleepless night or a bit of tension slowly turned into a daily ritual. Soon, the doses had to be increased to achieve the same effect, and the once helpful substance became a crutch, one that, for many, was impossible to break. And yet, the addiction was often hidden, concealed behind a veneer of respectability. In a society that revered image and reputation, admitting to addiction was almost unthinkable. The very idea of a respectable woman being addicted to a substance like opium was scandalous. It didn't fit the image of the ideal Victorian lady, dainty, virtuous, and controlled. If a woman was found to be addicted to laudanum, it wasn't just her physical health that was at risk. Her social standing, her reputation, her very identity as a respectable woman was threatened. She could be shunned, ostracized, or at the very least, misunderstood. The stigma surrounding addiction, particularly in women, led to many of them suffering in silence, unable to seek help or find any sort of relief from their spiraling dependence. The secrecy surrounding addiction was compounded by the fact that Victorian society had very specific and often contradictory views on women. They were expected to be fragile and yet steadfast, weak and yet resilient. Their emotional states were often dismissed as hysteria, their physical pain reduced to female troubles. And so, the very qualities that made them susceptible to addiction, being trapped in an emotional and social straitjacket, were ignored or minimized. A woman who could not cope with her emotions, who found herself overwhelmed by the pressures of her role, was simply given laudanum to calm her nerves. There was no acknowledgement of the deeper societal issues that were causing these problems, nor any real attempt to address the emotional needs of women. Instead, the solution was to medicate them into compliance. As the years passed, the scale of opium addiction among women grew, though it remained largely invisible. Those who became addicted were often seen as weak-willed or morally flawed. Yet their dependence was rarely acknowledged as the result of a larger societal and medical failure. It was far easier to place the blame on the individual than to confront the fact that society was pushing women into a corner where drugs seemed to be the only solution. Doctors continued to prescribe opium-based solutions, and the opium trade continued to flourish. But as more and more women fell into the trap of addiction, it became clear that what had started as a medical miracle had evolved into a public health crisis. This was the hidden crisis of Victorian London. Beneath the polished veneer of respectability, behind the image of perfect wives and mothers, there existed a quiet epidemic, one that affected the lives of countless women, often with tragic consequences. The opium epidemic among Victorian women is a story of medical neglect, societal pressure, and the devastating consequences of addiction. But it is also a story of survival, of women finding a way to cope with an unyielding world by relying on a substance that promised relief but delivered only pain. And in the end, it is a story that we can still learn from today, as we continue to confront the complex issues surrounding addiction and its impact on society. In this hidden crisis, Victorian women became the unseen victims of a society that refused to acknowledge their pain. They were caught in a cycle of dependency, one that was difficult to break and even harder to understand. Laudanum, opium, and other similar substances were offered as solutions, but in reality, they only served to deepen the problem. The true tragedy of this epidemic was not just the physical toll it took, but the emotional and social toll as well. These women were not only battling addiction, they were also battling a society that refused to see them as fully human, with complex emotional and psychological needs. Instead, they were medicated into submission, their struggles hidden behind closed doors, their pain ignored until it was too late. The social facade of respectability. In the heart of Victorian London, where the gas lamps flickered through the fog and horse-drawn carriages clattered along cobbled streets, there existed a stark dichotomy. On one side, the grand homes of the wealthy gleamed with polished brass and glistening windows. Inside, women moved with grace, wrapped in layers of silk, lace, and velvet, their postures perfect, their smiles poised. The world saw them as paragons of virtue, the epitome of grace and decorum. They were the mothers, the wives, the daughters who upheld the reputation of their families, and by extension, the very fabric of society. They were the icons of morality, expected to live up to an ideal that society had crafted for them, a flawless image of femininity. But behind closed doors, in the private sanctuaries of these homes, another reality existed, one that was hidden from the prying eyes of society. Beneath the polished surface of Victorian respectability, many women were struggling with demons that were far more dangerous than the modesty their public personas demanded. For these women, the weight of society's expectations, the pressure to maintain perfect homes, perfect marriages, and perfect appearances became too much to bear. And so, they turned to something that could offer them relief, however temporary: opium. Opium was widely available, seen as an acceptable medicine for a variety of ailments. Doctors, often male and powerful, prescribed it liberally for everything from menstrual cramps to the female condition known as the vapors. It soothed, it calmed, and for many women, it provided a welcome escape from the suffocating grip of social expectations. But this escape came at a heavy price. As women became more dependent on opium to cope with the crushing demands of their lives, the perfect image they worked so hard to maintain began to erode. What the world saw, their smiles, their composure, their grace, was not the full picture. Beneath that surface, there was an addiction, one that they kept hidden, locked away in their hearts and in their minds. The social facade of respectability that Victorian women had to uphold was a precarious thing. A single misstep could result in public scandal, a tarnished reputation, and the ruin of everything they had worked for. To be a woman in Victorian society meant to be constantly aware of how others perceived you. Respectability was a fragile construct, one that was easily shattered. Women were expected to embody purity and virtue, their every move scrutinized by society. This image of moral excellence was not just a matter of personal pride, it was a matter of social survival. But while society demanded perfection, it also created conditions that led to an epidemic of silent suffering. For many women, the addictive properties of opium were not initially apparent. What began as a prescribed treatment for pain, anxiety, or sleeplessness soon turned into a need, a craving. What was once a medicine became a constant companion, something that soothed away the anxiety, the isolation, and the despair that came from living a life bound by rigid social rules. Yet, while addiction was rampant, it was also deeply stigmatized, particularly among women. To be addicted to a substance was a moral failing, an indication of weakness. In a society that placed such high value on women's purity and decorum, addiction was the antithesis of what was expected. A woman addicted to opium was no longer the idealized figure of virtue. She was tainted, flawed, a shadow of the woman she was supposed to be. The irony was that while addiction was so widespread, particularly among the upper classes, it was seldom acknowledged, especially when it came to women. In fact, the very stigma that surrounded addiction kept many women from seeking help or even acknowledging their problem. The notion of a respectable woman grappling with addiction was almost unthinkable. For the women who were caught in this web, the private reality was one of constant fear. Fear of being discovered, of being labeled as immoral or unfit. If their addiction were discovered, their social standing would be destroyed, their reputation irreparably damaged. The consequences of public knowledge were severe. They could be ostracized, shunned by their families, and cast out from polite society. Many women struggled in silence, unable to find help because there was no space in Victorian society for the acknowledgement of such issues. The very idea of a woman, a respectable, gentle woman, being addicted to opium was anathema to the ideals that governed Victorian life. The cultural attitude toward women's addiction was rooted in the belief that they were fragile and overly emotional, prone to fits of hysteria or unreasoning behavior. The very qualities that made women more susceptible to addiction were the same qualities that Victorian society used to define their character. Women were seen as emotional beings, unable to control their impulses, their desires, or their fears. Opium, in this context, was a supposed cure for those frailties, a medicine that was meant to restore them to balance. But, as with many other treatments of the time, the long-term effects were ignored or downplayed. Doctors, many of whom were male, prescribed opium-based solutions for women's ailments without considering the potential for addiction. Women were not warned about the dangers of becoming dependent on such a substance. They were simply told that it would help them feel better. The consequences of long-term use were not something that doctors of the era fully understood or even considered. After all, women were not meant to question the decisions of doctors or the prescriptions they were given. They were expected to trust those in positions of authority. The stigma attached to addiction in women led to a peculiar kind of double life. In public, these women maintained their roles as the paragons of Victorian femininity, their impeccable manners and perfect poise hiding the fact that they were battling an addiction in private. It was a secret life that no one dared to acknowledge. And yet it was the reality for so many. The distance between what was expected and what was real was vast. Women were expected to bear their suffering with grace, to keep their struggles hidden behind a veil of dignity. To do otherwise was to risk scandal, social ruin, and shame. For those who were found out, the consequences were severe. Women who were publicly revealed to be addicted were often shunned, discarded by their families, or confined to asylums. The idea of rehabilitation was not widely recognized in Victorian society. There was no support system for women who struggled with addiction, no safe space where they could seek help without fear of judgment. The stigma of addiction was so pervasive that it became part of the narrative of women's lives, a silent struggle that many endured but few were willing to speak of. In the Victorian era, respectability was everything. It was the foundation upon which women built their lives, their identities, and their place in society. To lose it was to lose everything. And yet, beneath the polished surface of this respectable image, many women were silently suffering from the grip of opium addiction. Their addiction, hidden behind closed doors, was a consequence of a society that demanded perfection while offering no space for imperfection. The paradox of Victorian womanhood, the ideal of purity, virtue, and composure, juxtaposed with the reality of addiction, was a deeply ingrained part of the social fabric of the time. It was a reality that few were willing to acknowledge, and one that would remain hidden in the shadows of history for years to come. But as the years passed, and as more and more women began to succumb to the ravages of addiction, the facade of respectability began to crack. The truth could no longer be ignored. The epidemic of opium addiction that plagued Victorian women was not just a story of personal failure. It was a reflection of a larger societal issue, one that had long been hidden beneath the polished veneer of Victorian propriety. It was a story of women caught in a cycle of dependence, a cycle that was fueled by a society that valued appearance over reality and upheld an ideal that was impossible to achieve. The paradox of Victorian womanhood, of being both fragile and strong, virtuous and flawed, in control yet completely at the mercy of societal expectations, was something that no one dared to question. It was a system that demanded perfection and punished imperfection, and for many women, the price of maintaining that perfection was far too high. It was a price that many paid with their health, their dignity, and their lives. The pharmaceutical industry's role. As Victorian London continued to expand, so too did the sprawling influence of the pharmaceutical industry. The grandeur of the city was matched by a parallel surge in medical advancements, or at least what was considered medical progress at the time. The Industrial Revolution had brought with it a new era of experimentation and commerce, and with it came a flood of new treatments, cures, and potions. Among the most significant, perhaps the most insidious, was opium. It became a commodity, no longer just a luxury for the elite or a prescribed treatment for the sick, but an industry unto itself. In the mid-19th century, opium's perceived medicinal value had already been well established, largely due to the widespread use of laudanum, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol. This elixir was marketed as a cure-all for everything from anxiety and insomnia to menstrual cramps and even teething pain in infants. In this time of medical uncertainty, with little understanding of addiction or its consequences, opium was viewed as an effective and often miraculous solution for a vast range of ailments. Doctors and chemists alike hailed it as a potent panacea, capable of soothing both the body and the mind. But the true revolution in the use of opium came not from the hands of physicians, but from the manufacturers who saw the potential for profit. The pharmaceutical industry, emboldened by the expanding market and the growing acceptance of opium as a treatment, began to manufacture and sell opium-based products on an unprecedented scale. These products were sold in drugstores, from back-alley apothecaries to the most reputable chemists on high-end streets. Every Victorian, from the destitute working poor to the wealthiest aristocrats, had access to these medicines, often marketed with promises of guaranteed relief. It was the middle and upper classes that became the primary targets of this booming market. Opium, with its calming properties, became synonymous with refinement, sophistication, and an understanding of medicine that had once been reserved for the elite. The idea that you could simply take a remedy to relieve the stresses of daily life, whether caused by business, personal affairs, or the sheer weight of societal expectations, was incredibly appealing to the Victorian mindset. This was a society where image and social standing meant everything, and appearances often had to be maintained at all costs. But beneath the surface of this society's well-manicured, highly polished veneer, an undercurrent of addiction began to flow. The drug manufacturers were well aware of this, and they capitalized on it. Opium-based products were advertised as essential to the health and well-being of the affluent. Salesmen, advertisements, and shopkeepers would confidently assure customers that these cures were completely safe. There was no hint of the dangers of addiction. Rather, there was only a promise of peace, of calm, of the ability to remain composed in a world filled with pressures and contradictions. People who could afford to escape the stresses of life with a simple remedy were encouraged to do so, often without a second thought. From headache powders to nervine tonics, opium was sold in countless forms, each one promising to relieve the strain of modern life. The product that eventually became the most famous of these was laudanum, but it was by no means the only option available. There were opium-based medicines marketed specifically for women, as society placed an enormous emotional burden on women in Victorian England, with the idea that women were especially prone to emotional instability. A host of feminine products flooded the market, all promising relief from the most mundane to the most distressing symptoms. Products like Mother's Friend and Dr. Moffat's teething syrup were routinely prescribed to women and children, not just to ease physical pain, but to quiet the emotional turmoil that was often seen as part of the female condition. Meanwhile, in the medical community, doctors continued to prescribe opium with little concern. Despite its addictive properties, opium was still widely accepted as a therapeutic remedy. even in cases where it was clear that the underlying problem might require a more nuanced treatment. Doctors were, in many cases, complicit in the rapid rise of addiction, but they had little understanding of how destructive opium could be. In an era before the development of addiction medicine and with an incomplete understanding of addiction's neurological mechanisms, it was easy for the pharmaceutical companies to convince both the public and the medical community that opium-based products were harmless, or at least that their benefits outweighed any potential drawbacks. This normalization of opium's role in society was reinforced by a network of influential people who stood to profit from its widespread use. The pharmaceutical industry had become so deeply entwined with daily life that it seemed impossible to imagine a world without it. The opium trade, from the East India Company to the small apothecaries in London, had already established a vast infrastructure that brought this potent drug to the doorsteps of the elite. As the addiction problem deepened, the very same forces that had benefited from the spread of opium turned a blind eye to its devastating effects. Perhaps the most striking aspect of the Victorian opium trade was how the middle class became both the victim and the beneficiary. The very same class that prided itself on being morally upright and industrious was now ensnared in a web of addiction. Victorian women, in particular, were disproportionately affected by this crisis. They were given prescriptions for laudanum for everything from stress to insomnia to what was considered the nervous constitution of the time. But instead of curing them, these opiate-based remedies only further entrenched their dependence, leading to a dangerous cycle that would be difficult to break. For the pharmaceutical industry, the expansion of opium use was an opportunity they could not afford to miss. With the growing demand for products that promised quick and effective relief, drug manufacturers saw a chance to make fortunes. They marketed these drugs directly to the public, particularly women, using advertisements that highlighted the supposed benefits, ease of use, quick relief, and safety. There was no mention of the dark side, no warning about the addictive potential of these substances. In many ways, the rise of the pharmaceutical industry mirrored the larger industrial revolution, fast-paced, profit-driven, and largely unchecked by the social or ethical concerns that might have slowed its growth. The same forces that led to rapid technological advances in industry and transportation also fueled the expansion of the drug trade, creating a situation where addiction was not only normalized but marketed as a necessary part of the Victorian way of life. But beneath the sleek advertisements and the assurances of safety, addiction was taking root in Victorian society. Those who had once believed they were simply relieving the common stresses of life were now facing an epidemic that, while hidden in plain sight, was beginning to take its toll. The pharmaceutical industry had built an empire on opium, but it was one built on shaky foundations. The very products that had promised to improve the lives of the people would ultimately destroy them. As the years passed, the cracks in this carefully constructed world began to show. The women who had been prescribed opium for their nerves were now hooked on a substance that they could not escape. The families who had once believed they were simply following the advice of trusted doctors found themselves caught in the grip of a silent epidemic. And all the while, the pharmaceutical industry continued to profit, oblivious or perhaps indifferent to the human cost of its success. This was the true price of the opium trade, the exploitation of addiction, a crisis that would become so widespread that it would eventually lead to calls for regulation and reform. But for now, the industry continued to thrive, its products flooding the market, its influence growing stronger by the day. The Victorian age was one of great change, but it was also an age of contradictions. The same society that prized morality and respectability was, in many ways, built on the backs of those who had no voice, who suffered in silence while their addiction slowly consumed them. The role of the pharmaceutical industry in this tragic story cannot be overstated. for it was the engine that kept the wheels of this dark epidemic turning. International trade and opium supply. As we move forward in our story, we must turn our attention to the greater forces at play, the vast networks of trade, and the imperial ambitions that set the stage for the opium epidemic that would sweep through Victorian London. The story of opium in Britain does not begin with the simple arrival of a drug on a merchant ship, but rather with centuries of imperial conquest, exploitation, and a deeply entrenched global system of trade. It is here, within the folds of colonialism and international trade, that we find the roots of a public health crisis that would devastate countless lives in London and beyond. To understand the true scale of the opium epidemic, we must trace its origins back to the very heart of British imperialism, where the seeds of addiction were sown across continents. The British Empire's global reach during the 18th and 19th centuries had long depended on a network of trade routes that spanned the globe. From India to Africa, from the Caribbean to the Far East, Britain's influence stretched across every corner of the earth, carving out an empire based not only on territorial control, but also on the control of resources. Among these resources, few were as valuable as opium, a commodity that would come to play a central role in the geopolitics of the empire and the personal health crises of its citizens. Opium's journey to Britain began in India, where British traders established a strong presence through the East India Company. The company, a powerful trading entity that functioned as both a commercial enterprise and a de facto colonial government, saw the vast potential of the opium poppy. In the fertile lands of Bengal and Bihar, British cultivators began growing opium on a massive scale, exploiting the cheap labor of local farmers to produce the drug. At the time, opium was widely used in India, where it had a long history of medicinal use. However, under British control, opium production expanded exponentially, not for the benefit of the local population, but to fuel an ever-growing demand in foreign markets, primarily in China and, eventually, in Britain itself. The British Empire's pursuit of opium was not born out of any humanitarian impulse or medicinal need, but out of a simple desire for profit. Opium's effects were highly addictive, and the British saw it as an ideal commodity to trade in China. The Chinese had a long-standing cultural history with opium, but the British wanted to flood the market with it. The stage was set for what would become one of the most infamous chapters in colonial history, the Opium Wars. The first Opium War, which began in 1839, was the result of rising tensions between the British and the Qing dynasty in China. Opium, which had been illegally traded in China for many years, was wreaking havoc on Chinese society. Millions of Chinese people were becoming addicted to the drug, and its impact on the workforce, public health, and the overall stability of the empire was devastating. The Chinese government, in a bid to curb the damage, began to confiscate and destroy opium shipments. This action triggered a violent response from Britain, which had a vested interest in keeping the opium trade alive and thriving. The ensuing conflict, which lasted until 1842, resulted in the Treaty of Nanking, which forced China to open its ports to British trade, including opium. In exchange, Britain was granted trading rights and territory in China, most notably Hong Kong. The treaty, while devastating for China, was a resounding success for Britain and cemented the country's position as a global power with the ability to force open markets through war. The Second Opium War, which began in 1856, would further entrench Britain's control over the opium trade in China, and the addiction crisis in China would only deepen. It is from these colonial and imperial actions that the opium trade began to flow more freely to Britain itself. The widespread availability of opium on the British market was not an accident. British merchants, both in China and in India, had seen the economic value of opium. It was not just an exotic luxury for the wealthy. It was now an integral part of British commerce. The East India Company, the very symbol of British colonial power, had created an efficient supply chain that brought opium to ports in London, where it was sold in drugstores and pharmacies to the general public. It was marketed as a cure-all, prescribed by doctors for everything from chronic pain and insomnia to digestive issues and anxiety. Opium-based medicines such as laudanum and morphine were widely used, accepted even in polite society, and were available to anyone who could afford them. But the drug's impact was not confined to the colonial world or the upper class. As opium flooded the streets of London, so too did its addictive grip. The people who had first been exposed to opium in its medicinal form, those with the means to afford the prescriptions, were soon followed by the working poor. Opium was sold in forms that made it accessible to all, in the form of tonics, syrups, and pills. And in a society where a doctor's prescription was regarded as an unquestioned authority, it wasn't long before the addiction epidemic began to take root. In the early days, the addictive properties of opium were not well understood. In fact, for much of the 19th century, opium was largely seen as a solution, not a problem. Its effects were celebrated in medical journals and pharmacies, its status elevated by doctors and chemists who profited from its widespread use. It was hailed as a miracle cure, often recommended for everything from a bad cough to the pain of childbirth. It was advertised in popular newspapers and marketed by influential doctors who made fortunes off selling these opium-based remedies. Opium was not just a product of British imperialism. It became woven into the fabric of British society, from the wealthiest to the poorest, from doctors to street vendors. The drug found its place as a staple in the everyday lives of Victorians. The irony was not lost on the very people who benefited from the opium trade. In a society built on the exploitation of distant lands, the addiction it fostered was just one more consequence of imperialism's far-reaching effects. The wealth of the British Empire, in its finest hour, was paid for by addiction not just in the colonies, but at home in London itself. The connection between British imperialism, the Opium Wars, and the addiction crisis in London is clear, yet it is often overlooked in the grand narrative of British colonial triumph. The drug was not just a side effect of empire, it was an instrument of control, a tool of profit that was used to manipulate entire populations, both abroad and at home. It was a substance that reflected the darker side of Victorian society, the side that relied on exploitation, addiction, and greed to maintain its power and privilege. As the demand for opium grew, so too did the addiction that followed in its wake. By the late 19th century, the problem was undeniable. The consequences of the British Empire's colonial policies and their impact on the opium trade were now felt on the streets of London, where an epidemic of addiction was ravaging families, ruining lives, and entrenching a cycle of dependence that would persist for generations. The drug was no longer just a commodity. It had become a symbol of the price of empire, a reminder that even the most refined aspects of Victorian society were built on the suffering of others. The opium epidemic in Victorian London serves as a stark reminder of the connections between imperialism, trade, and addiction. The legacy of the Opium Wars, while not often discussed in polite society, is a crucial part of the history of both China and Britain. For the British, the trade in opium was not just about the pursuit of wealth, it was about control. And as we have seen, that control extended far beyond the shores of China, impacting the very fabric of British society. The opium epidemic in London was the silent, hidden cost of empire, a consequence that would echo through the streets of London long after the last opium shipment had docked at port. The invisible epidemic, impact on families. The story of opium's impact on Victorian London would not be complete without understanding the unseen and often tragic consequences it had on families, particularly the women who were its most frequent victims. The invisible epidemic, as it has been called, did not just affect the individuals who ingested the drug, but it rippled through entire households, altering the very fabric of family life. While opium was widely accepted in medical circles as a remedy for ailments like anxiety, insomnia, and menstrual cramps, its addictive properties were devastating, especially when prescribed to women, who were often vulnerable to the societal pressures of perfection and respectability. The struggle with addiction, coupled with the weight of the roles that women were expected to play as wives, mothers, and caretakers, formed a tragic paradox that was hidden in plain sight. In Victorian society, the family was a cornerstone of social structure. The idea of a woman's role in the home was sacred, and she was expected to be the emotional and moral anchor of her family. Wives were to be devoted to their husbands, and mothers were to nurture and care for their children. Women's emotional strength, stability, and grace were all viewed as critical components of their identity. Yet behind this idealized image, many women were secretly grappling with opium addiction, a battle that was invisible to the outside world but quietly tearing apart the families they were supposed to protect. Opium, as we know, was often prescribed to women by their doctors, sometimes for conditions as common as anxiety, menstrual pain, or the deep fatigue that came with their demanding domestic duties. In an era when women were expected to suppress their own needs and focus on their families, the idea of opium as a harmless medicinal substance was alluring. But as with any addiction, what began as a form of relief slowly turned into something far darker. Women became dependent on the drug to cope with their lives. But as their addiction deepened, their ability to maintain the roles that Victorian society had assigned to them began to erode. For many women, the emotional toll was the hardest to bear. The pressure to be the heart of the home, to manage a household with love and care, was constant. But opium addiction distorted this image of domestic tranquility. As women became more dependent on the drug, they increasingly withdrew from their families. The once vibrant and caring mothers and wives became shadows of themselves, physically numb and emotionally distant. What once were small moments of neglect became larger gaps in the emotional bonds that held families together. Children were left without the warmth and nurturing their mothers were supposed to provide, and husbands were often left to pick up the slack, though they too were often unaware of the true nature of their wives' struggles. The physical toll that addiction took on these women was equally devastating. Opium, in its various forms such as laudanum, tinctures, or powders, would numb the pain and create a sense of euphoria. But this euphoria came with its own price. Prolonged use of the drug led to deteriorating health, nausea, vomiting, loss of appetite, and, over time, the complete collapse of the body's natural rhythm. Women who were once the pillars of their homes, performing the duties of housework, child-rearing, and socializing, found themselves unable to keep up with these expectations. Their physical health slowly deteriorated, and many found it impossible to hide the effects from their families. The once flourishing household began to suffer in every way imaginable. Filth would accumulate, children's needs went unmet, and the husband was forced to bear not only the financial burden of the home, but the emotional weight of a failing marriage. Psychologically, the impact on women was also profound. The very nature of addiction being a secret, hidden away behind the veil of social respectability, left these women isolated. They were torn between their desire to be the dutiful wife and mother that society expected them to be, and the increasing need for the drug that controlled them. Guilt and shame accompanied their addiction, further isolating them from their families. They had to hide the truth, pretending to be strong when they were weak, pretending to be in control when they were not. Their minds and bodies became battlegrounds, each dose of opium taking them further away from the women they once were, yet simultaneously bringing them closer to the only form of solace they could find. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the addiction was the emotional neglect that came with it. A mother who was once lovingly present for her children could no longer provide that same care. and a wife, who had once been a source of strength and comfort for her husband, could no longer play that role. Children were left to fend for themselves, often neglected in favor of their mother's addiction, with little understanding of what was happening. They were too young to understand the complexities of addiction, and the shame of it often meant that the truth was never spoken aloud. Husbands, too, were left confused and often in denial, unable to understand why their wives had changed so drastically. What began as a seemingly harmless remedy for common ailments soon became the crux of their family's destruction. Yet the stigma surrounding addiction ensured that no one would talk about it openly. The issue of addiction among women was further compounded by the secrecy and shame that surrounded it. In a society where reputation was paramount, addiction was seen not just as a personal failing, but as a moral one. Women, in particular, were expected to maintain the highest standards of moral propriety. If a woman was known to be addicted to opium, it was considered a shameful weakness that could reflect poorly on her entire family. As a result, these women hid their struggles from the public eye, often to the detriment of their own well-being. It became a silent epidemic, one that was brushed under the rug in favor of preserving the idealized image of the perfect Victorian woman. Behind the facades of respectability and order, entire families were quietly unraveling. The lack of understanding surrounding addiction at the time made it all the more difficult for these women to seek help. There were no modern treatment options, no recognition of the disease of addiction as we understand it today. Instead, women suffering from opium addiction were often seen as morally weak or as women who had failed in their duties. The idea that addiction could be a medical issue, something beyond the woman's control, was not widely accepted. For many, the only solutions to their suffering came in the form of more drugs or even more dangerous medical procedures. And so, the cycle of addiction continued, trapping these women in a world of guilt, shame, and emotional pain. The ripple effect of women's addiction to opium was devastating not only for the women themselves, but for the families they left behind. Husbands and children, often unaware of the true nature of their wives' struggles, suffered in silence. The home, once a place of warmth and security, became a place of emotional neglect, instability, and fear. While opium may have been prescribed as a medicine, its effects were anything but healing for the Victorian women caught in its grip. And though society remained largely blind to the hidden epidemic, it was those very families that paid the price. The tragic irony is that this epidemic of addiction, though affecting so many lives, remained largely invisible in the public eye. The shame of addiction, particularly when it involved women, kept the issue buried behind closed doors. But as we know, nothing stays hidden forever. The impact of this crisis would eventually make its way into the public consciousness. But by then, the damage had already been done. Women had suffered in silence, and families had been torn apart, all under the weight of an epidemic that no one seemed willing to acknowledge. This story, then, is not just about addiction. It is about the hidden struggles of women in a society that demanded perfection, about the families torn apart by addiction, and about the shame that kept these tragic stories locked away from the light of day. The legal landscape, the struggle for accountability. The opium epidemic in Victorian London was a silent plague, one that spread through society unnoticed and unacknowledged by the very systems designed to protect the people. While the effects of opium addiction were felt in every corner of society, the law turned a blind eye to the growing crisis. As the number of women, men, and children using opium-based products rose, the legal and medical systems failed to act, leaving many trapped in a cycle of dependency with little hope for recovery. In the early days of the opium trade, the addictive properties of opium were not fully understood. What began as a widely accepted medicine quickly escalated into a full-blown crisis. Opium, particularly in the form of laudanum, was seen as a cure-all, prescribed for everything from anxiety and insomnia to menstrual pain and digestive issues. It was sold freely in pharmacies, and physicians routinely recommended it to their patients. This widespread acceptance of opium as a remedy created a dangerous environment where addiction thrived without any recognition or regulation. Despite its growing prevalence, the law largely ignored the epidemic. There were no significant regulations in place to monitor the sale or distribution of opium and opiate-based products. In fact, opium was legally available in stores, with little oversight as to who could purchase it or in what quantities. The notion that people could become addicted to these substances was not part of the public discourse. At this point in history, addiction was not yet seen as a disease or a medical condition. It was considered a moral failing, a sign of weakness or lack of willpower. As a result, the legal system did not prioritize the welfare of those suffering from addiction, leaving many without recourse or support. The failure of the legal system to address the growing problem of addiction created a vacuum in which those suffering from the effects of opium dependence were left to fend for themselves. The lack of legal action against the sale of opium meant that pharmaceutical companies continued to profit from the widespread availability of these drugs, flooding the market with opium-based remedies. Meanwhile, the absence of any formal support systems for individuals struggling with addiction left them isolated and unsupported, with few options for help. Medical professionals, too, were slow to recognize the scope of the problem. While some physicians began to suspect that the use of opium was causing harm, many continued to prescribe it liberally, either unaware of its addictive nature or unwilling to confront the consequences. The reluctance of medical professionals to acknowledge the addictive properties of opium-based products made it difficult for the public to understand the dangers of these substances. For years, the medical community continued to promote opium as a solution to a wide variety of ailments, reinforcing its widespread use and normalizing its consumption. As the years went by, the number of people addicted to opium grew, but the legal landscape remained stagnant. There was no push from the government or the medical community to regulate the sale of opium or to create programs to help those struggling with addiction. It wasn't until later in the 19th century, when the devastating effects of the epidemic could no longer be ignored, that the public began to recognize addiction as a public health issue. In the meantime, women were disproportionately affected by the crisis, and their struggles remained hidden behind the veneer of Victorian respectability. The stigma surrounding addiction, particularly for women, made it all the more difficult for them to seek help. Women who became addicted to opium were often seen as morally corrupt, as society expected them to maintain an image of purity and virtue. As a result, many women suffered in silence, their addiction quietly destroying their health and their families, with no legal or social safety nets to catch them. The legal system's refusal to address addiction was not just an oversight. It was a reflection of the broader societal attitudes of the time. In Victorian society, women were expected to maintain a perfect image of respectability, and addiction was a stain on that image. Addiction was not viewed as a medical condition but as a moral failure, and therefore, the law did not intervene to provide support for those suffering from it. It wasn't until much later, as the scope of the epidemic became clearer and the damage more severe, that the legal system began to consider the possibility of regulating opium and opiate-based products. In the years that followed, the first laws addressing opium addiction were introduced, but by then, the damage had already been done. The public health crisis was far-reaching, and its impact on families and communities could not be undone. The legal system, which had remained silent for so long, had allowed the epidemic to spread unchecked, leaving countless victims in its wake. The struggle for accountability was slow and difficult, but it eventually led to the regulation of opium use in the 20th century. The first steps toward curbing the epidemic were taken with the introduction of the Dangerous Drugs Act of 1920, which sought to regulate the use of opium and other addictive substances. However, By the time these laws were enacted, the opium epidemic had already taken a heavy toll on society. In the early years of the 20th century, the addictive nature of opium was finally acknowledged, and the public began to understand the extent of the damage it had caused. Medical professionals began to treat addiction as a disease, and support systems for those struggling with addiction were slowly put into place. Yet, the road to recovery for those affected by the epidemic was long and painful. Many women, who had been the primary victims of the crisis, continued to suffer in silence, their addiction a lifelong battle that was only just beginning to be recognized as a legitimate health issue. The legal landscape, too, would continue to evolve, as lawmakers and medical professionals grappled with how to address the growing problem of addiction. The impact of the opium epidemic on Victorian society was far-reaching, and it left scars that would take decades to heal. But the legal struggle for accountability, the slow recognition of addiction as a public health issue, and the eventual regulation of opium use laid the groundwork for the future of addiction treatment and the fight for public health. In the end, the story of opium addiction in Victorian London is one of tragedy, neglect, and slow progress. It is a reminder of the failure of the legal and medical systems to protect those who were most vulnerable, and the long road to acknowledging addiction as a public health crisis. The women who suffered in silence, the families torn apart by addiction, and the communities devastated by the epidemic all paid a heavy price for the lack of accountability and the slow recognition of addiction as a disease. But in the midst of this darkness, change eventually came, though it was long overdue. Psychological and physical toll on women. As we continue to uncover the hidden tragedies of the opium epidemic in Victorian London, it's essential to examine the toll this widespread addiction took on those who were most vulnerable, the women of the era. Women were not just the silent victims of this crisis, they were the hidden casualties, struggling beneath the weight of addiction while maintaining the facade of Victorian propriety. The psychological and physical toll on women was immense, yet largely ignored, as they were trapped in a society that demanded perfect decorum and self-restraint. For many women, the journey into addiction began innocently enough. Laudanum, a popular opium-based medicine, was commonly prescribed by doctors for a variety of ailments, from anxiety and insomnia to menstrual pain and depression. For women who were often confined to their homes and subjected to the emotional and physical strains of domestic life, these opiate-based solutions seemed like a godsend. They were offered relief, however temporary, from the burden of their roles as wives and mothers. But little did they know that this medicine would slowly tighten its grip, leading them into a dangerous cycle of dependency. The psychological toll of opium addiction on women was profound. While opium was originally prescribed to relieve pain, its long-term effects were far from healing. For many women, the drug did little to ease the emotional turmoil of their lives, and in fact, only exacerbated it. Opium-induced euphoria quickly turned into a mental and emotional prison. The drug dulled the senses, numbed feelings, and provided an escape from the demands of life. But it also left women trapped in an ever-deepening spiral of psychological distress. Opium created a paradox for women. It promised relief, but instead, it bred a profound sense of isolation and despair. Over time, the initial sense of comfort and relaxation provided by opium gave way to anxiety and depression, and for many, the drug only intensified their emotional fragility. The Victorian ideal of women as delicate, fragile creatures who were emotionally unstable, needing protection and care, was, ironically, the very stereotype that worked against them. Society viewed women's emotional struggles with disdain and condescension, labeling them as weak or hysterical, rather than understanding the devastating effects of opium on their psychological health. In this context, it's no surprise that many women's mental health began to deteriorate. What started as occasional use became an all-consuming need, as the drug provided the only means of escape from a society that demanded so much from women while offering so little in return. The paradox was painful. While women were expected to maintain an image of grace and restraint, they were also living in a world that pushed them into desperation, leaving them with few options but to rely on opium to cope with their struggles. Physically, the effects of opium addiction were just as debilitating. The initial relief that women felt from their pain or emotional struggles began to wear off as they became more dependent on the drug. As the addiction deepened, the physical toll on their bodies became increasingly evident. Prolonged use of opium led to a range of symptoms that were often debilitating and difficult to hide, especially in a society that demanded women to be physically composed and presentable at all times. One of the most common physical symptoms of opium addiction was lethargy. Opium has a sedative effect, and over time, this made it difficult for many women to summon the energy they needed to go about their daily tasks. The very women who were once expected to embody vitality and domestic efficiency were now physically exhausted, unable to fulfill the roles that society had assigned to them. They were trapped in a state of inertia, their bodies and minds locked in a battle with a substance that they no longer had the power to control. Nausea and digestive issues were also frequent side effects of opium use. The drug wreaked havoc on the digestive system, causing constipation, bloating, and a general sense of discomfort. For women who were already expected to maintain an immaculate appearance and graceful composure, these symptoms were often deeply distressing. Many women suffered in silence, unable to share the full extent of their suffering due to the stigma attached to addiction. As the physical toll mounted, women became more and more isolated, afraid to seek help or admit the extent of their dependence. In addition to nausea and lethargy, the long-term use of opium led to the gradual deterioration of health. The drug had a profound impact on the body, slowly eroding the health of those who relied on it. Women, who were already subject to the physical strains of childbirth, domestic work, and societal expectations, found their bodies deteriorating faster than they could repair them. As their addiction worsened, many women became physically emaciated, their once vibrant appearances fading into shadow. The sense of vitality that was expected of them as wives and mothers disappeared, replaced by the hollow, distant stare of someone locked in the grip of an insidious addiction. For women, the effects of opium addiction were not just a personal tragedy, they were a societal tragedy. In a time when reputation and respectability were of the utmost importance, these women faced the devastating reality of an addiction that they could not admit to. The societal judgment of addiction, particularly among women, was harsh and unforgiving. Women who were addicted to opium were often seen as morally corrupt, as failures in a society that prized decorum and virtue above all else. Addiction was not viewed as a disease, but as a moral failing, a sign of weakness that could not be forgiven. For these women, the addiction was a double-edged sword. On one hand, they were seeking relief from a world that offered them little empathy or understanding, but on the other, they were caught in a cycle of shame and degradation. Their addiction became a private struggle that could not be acknowledged, much less treated. Even when they sought help, the medical profession was not equipped to deal with addiction as a disease. Instead, they were often treated with further doses of opium, reinforcing the very cycle that was destroying them. This silent epidemic of opium addiction affected not just the women who were trapped in its grasp, but their families as well. Husbands, children, and extended families were often left to cope with the consequences of a mother, wife, or daughter who could no longer fulfill her duties. The emotional neglect, the withdrawal symptoms, and the physical deterioration were all hidden behind closed doors. As addiction became something that could not be acknowledged, much less treated, families were left to cope with the devastating effects of addiction in isolation, without the support systems that we might expect in today's world. The opium epidemic in Victorian London was not just a personal crisis for the women who were addicted to it. it was a reflection of the broader societal issues that plagued the era. It was a time when mental health and addiction were not understood in the way that they are today. Instead, they were shrouded in shame and secrecy, particularly when it came to women. The tragic irony was that, in a society that demanded perfection from its women, those very women were denied the help they so desperately needed. In conclusion, the psychological and physical toll of opium addiction on women in Victorian London was severe and far-reaching. The women who were addicted to opium found themselves trapped in a vicious cycle, suffering in silence as their bodies and minds deteriorated under the weight of an addiction that was both misunderstood and stigmatized. While society saw these women as fragile and weak, it failed to recognize the true nature of their suffering and the powerful hold that opium had over them. As the epidemic continued to grow, the consequences for these women physically, emotionally, and socially became more and more devastating, leaving behind a trail of hidden tragedies that were buried beneath the veneer of Victorian respectability. Public perception and hypocrisy. The Victorian era was a time of stark contrasts, a world where outward appearances were paramount, and society was obsessed with the maintenance of respectability. It was a period where rigid moral codes governed every aspect of life, from how one dressed, spoke, and behaved, to how they managed their personal struggles. But behind this veneer of decency, a much darker truth lingered, and nowhere was this more apparent than in the treatment of addiction, especially among women. The public's perception of addiction was steeped in hypocrisy, and it was a hypocrisy that led to the suffering of many, particularly the women of Victorian society. Addiction in the 19th century was not understood in the way it is today. Medical advancements were limited, and social attitudes were often archaic. In Victorian London, opium was widely accepted as a medicine, prescribed for everything from sleeplessness and anxiety to menstrual pain and even postnatal depression. Yet, despite its widespread use and the apparent relief it provided to many, addiction to opium was rarely seen as a medical condition. Instead, it was often dismissed as a moral failing. Those who found themselves dependent on opium were viewed as weak-willed, lacking the fortitude to control their desires, and in many cases, their addiction was treated as something shameful, something to be hidden away from public view. This view was especially harsh when it came to women. Victorian society had very specific and often unrealistic expectations of women's behavior. They were meant to be the moral backbone of the family, dutiful wives, loving mothers, and respectable members of society. Women were expected to remain serene, composed, and in control of their emotions. If a woman did not adhere to this ideal, society was quick to label her as flawed or morally weak. Addiction, in this context, was viewed as a sign of moral degradation, and the idea that a woman could become addicted to something as dangerous as opium was inconceivable to many in the upper classes. It was simply too unseemly for a woman, especially a respectable one, to fall victim to addiction. And yet, despite this stigma, opium addiction was increasingly prevalent among women, particularly those in the upper and middle classes. But because of the prevailing attitudes of the time, their suffering was either ignored or mischaracterized. Women were seen as passive victims, incapable of controlling their desires or their addiction, and this perception only deepened the societal shame surrounding the issue. Men, by contrast, were often viewed as being in control of their vices. A man who drank too much or smoked opium might be seen as indulging in a common, albeit troublesome, vice. But when a woman exhibited the same behaviors, it was viewed through a completely different lens. She was seen not as someone who had succumbed to temptation, but as someone who had failed her very purpose in life to be the moral compass of the home and family. This gendered disparity in how addiction was perceived reflected the larger social attitudes toward women in Victorian society. Women were expected to be pure, innocent, and free from the temptations and vices that men were allowed to indulge in. But when they did fall victim to addiction, it was seen as an act of personal failure, a moral lapse that tarnished their reputation and that of their family. This hypocrisy not only prevented women from receiving the help they needed, but also made it difficult for them to acknowledge or seek treatment for their addiction. It was easier for society to pretend that women didn't suffer from addiction, or that if they did, it was their own fault. The public's view of addiction began to shift, albeit slowly, when high-profile women from the upper echelons of society became victims of the opium epidemic. These women, who were meant to serve as models of decorum and virtue, were suddenly revealed to be struggling with addiction in secret. The exposure of their struggles was a shock to Victorian society, which had long held the belief that addiction was something that only affected the poor or those from less respectable backgrounds. But when the addiction crisis reached the highest echelons of society, it forced the public to confront the reality that opium addiction was not just a problem for the working class, it was a problem that crossed all social boundaries. These revelations were often met with a mix of fascination, disbelief, and pity. The idea that women, particularly those of high social standing, could fall victim to such a vice was simply too much for many to comprehend. In a world where image was everything, the idea of a respectable woman succumbing to addiction was not only embarrassing, it was a threat to the very fabric of Victorian society. Women of noble birth or aristocratic status were supposed to represent the pinnacle of social propriety. If they could fall victim to addiction, then what did that say about the moral decay of the society at large? As these high-profile cases unfolded, the public's perception of addiction shifted slightly. The epidemic was no longer something that could be swept under the rug. But even as the conversation around addiction began to change, the stigma surrounding it, particularly among women, remained. The shame of addiction was still very much alive, and even women who were brave enough to speak out about their struggles often found themselves condemned by society. The hypocrisy of Victorian views on addiction only deepened as it became clear that the very social structures that had once protected women now worked to imprison them in silence. This duality, the public image of women as pure and respectable, and the private reality of their addiction, was a tragic reflection of the rigid, often contradictory values of Victorian society. Women were expected to be perfect, yet the society around them offered them little support in coping with the pressures of life. Opium addiction, which was originally seen as a harmless remedy for a variety of ailments, became a silent epidemic, spreading through the upper classes and quietly destroying the lives of many women. But because addiction was still seen as a moral failing, the suffering of these women was largely ignored, and their struggle with addiction was hidden behind closed doors. The idea of addiction as a moral failing rather than a medical condition continued to dominate public discourse well into the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It wasn't until much later, as the medical profession began to evolve and better understand the nature of addiction, that opium's destructive impact on Victorian women was fully acknowledged. But by then, the damage had been done. The women who had suffered in silence for so long, hiding their addiction behind the constraints of societal expectations, had already paid the price. In many ways, the opium epidemic in Victorian London was a reflection of the society that allowed it to flourish. A society that was willing to turn a blind eye to the suffering of women in favor of preserving appearances. The hypocrisy surrounding addiction was not just a personal tragedy for those who lived through it. It was a reflection of the deep-seated gender inequality that pervaded Victorian life. Women, who were meant to uphold the highest standards of morality, were often left to suffer in isolation, their struggles with addiction hidden away in the shadows of a society that refused to acknowledge the true cost of its own hypocrisy. As the opium epidemic continued to wreak havoc on the lives of countless women, it became clear that this was not just an issue of addiction, it was a societal failure, one that stemmed from deep-rooted gender norms and expectations. The women who struggled with opium addiction were not weak or morally flawed. They were victims of a system that failed to understand their pain and provided them with little support in their darkest hours. The tragedy of their plight was compounded by the societal stigma that kept them silent and isolated, further reinforcing the devastating impact of Victorian hypocrisy. In the end, the story of opium addiction among Victorian women is a tale of personal suffering and societal neglect. It is a story of how women, despite their outward respectability, were often left to fight battles they were never equipped to win. And it is a story of how a society that demanded perfection from its women also failed to provide them with the understanding and compassion they needed to heal. The hypocrisy of Victorian society, as it pertained to addiction, serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of maintaining a facade of respectability at the expense of addressing the very real struggles that individuals face. Addiction as a gendered crisis. In the heart of Victorian society, where the walls of moral expectations were high and the societal gaze was always watchful, addiction was not only a personal tragedy but a profoundly gendered crisis. The opium epidemic, which swept through the streets of London and beyond, was not just a matter of substance use. It was intricately bound to the expectations and limitations placed upon women of that time. As the opium trade flourished and its use became widespread, it was the women who found themselves trapped in the heavy embrace of this drug, often with little more than the comforting lie of medical necessity to soothe their growing dependence. The opium epidemic, when viewed through the lens of gender, reveals a pattern of unequal burdens placed upon women, whose addiction was not only a personal affliction, but a social and moral downfall. At the time, women were far more likely to be prescribed opium-based remedies than their male counterparts, a fact that had roots in both medical practice and the gender norms that confined women to the domestic sphere. It was common for doctors to prescribe laudanum, an opiate-based tincture, for ailments like insomnia, menstrual pain, and anxiety, common struggles for women living in a society that regarded their emotions and physical discomforts as signs of weakness. This prescription of opium-based remedies for women was seen not as a danger, but rather as a solution, an answer to a problem society itself had created. Women were expected to be the fragile, delicate members of society, their emotions erratic and overwhelming. These very characteristics, seen as part of their inherent nature, were now treated with opium, a drug that offered temporary relief and comfort from the heavy expectations placed on them. The very drug that was meant to soothe their perceived weaknesses soon became the chain that bound them, as dependency crept in quietly, almost imperceptibly. It's important to understand the societal context that made women especially vulnerable to opium addiction. In an era where women's roles were largely confined to the home, their lives were framed by domesticity and the unrelenting pressures of maintaining a household. They were expected to bear children, care for the home, and provide emotional support to their husbands' duties that required an incredible amount of endurance. However, the strain of constant domestic labor, combined with the societal pressure to remain calm, controlled, and nurturing, often left women feeling anxious, overwhelmed, and exhausted. Opium, then, became a balm for these feelings, and it was readily available to those who sought relief. But this was a relief with dire consequences. Once the cycle of opium use began, it was difficult to break free. The drug, which had initially been prescribed as a cure, slowly and insidiously transformed into a means of escape. Women found themselves caught in a web of dependency, their bodies and minds altered by the continuous ingestion of the substance. The withdrawal symptoms were severe, painful, debilitating, and yet, so were the symptoms of dependence. For many women, The drug became the only way to navigate the overwhelming weight of their roles in society, the only way to quiet the demands of their bodies and minds. The gendered nature of addiction extended far beyond the physical toll. For women in the Victorian era, addiction was not merely a personal failure, it was a moral one, a stain on their character that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Society did not view women as individuals who could succumb to addiction through poor choices or misfortune. Instead, addiction was seen as a reflection of their innate weakness, their lack of moral fortitude. Women who became addicted were viewed as having failed in their most sacred duty, maintaining their purity, their grace, and their virtue. The stigma of addiction, particularly in women, was immense. A woman addicted to opium was no longer viewed as a respectable member of society. She was seen as tainted, as unfit for the roles of wife, mother, and caretaker. In a society that placed so much importance on a woman's reputation, her descent into addiction spelled ruin. The social standing of women was fragile at best, and addiction stripped them of any remaining claim to respectability. Their future prospects, which had once been so carefully shaped by their family connections and social status, were now in jeopardy. A woman who had fallen into addiction faced the possibility of being ostracized from her community, cut off from her family, and left with few options. The stigma of addiction was not easily erased. A woman could recover from illness, but she could never recover from the moral judgment of addiction. This harsh judgment was compounded by the fact that many women's addictions were hidden, kept in the shadows of the home, where they could not be easily detected by the public eye. In a society that valued outward respectability above all else, women had to hide their struggles, bearing them in silence. They were often unable to speak openly about their addiction, fearing further judgment and rejection. This silence became a suffocating barrier, making it even harder to seek help, even when it was desperately needed. The impact of addiction on women's lives, then, was not confined to the physical and emotional toll of the drug itself. It was a crisis that touched every aspect of their existence, from their health to their social standing to their very identity. Women who became addicted were forced to reckon not only with the destruction of their bodies but also with the collapse of their societal roles. In the rigidly defined world of Victorian gender roles, a woman who could not conform to the expectations of purity, self-control, and grace was left to navigate a life of isolation and shame. The gendered nature of the opium epidemic was not only a reflection of the medical practices of the time, but also of the larger social and cultural forces that shaped women's lives. Women were more likely to be prescribed opium-based remedies, not because they needed them more, but because their suffering, emotional and physical, was seen as something that could be soothed with medicine. However, this medicine was not a cure but a curse. The drug was not only a way of alleviating the pain of life, but also a way of reinforcing the power dynamics that kept women in their place. Addiction, in this context, was not just about the loss of control over one's body, it was about the loss of control over one's destiny, one's reputation, and one's place in society. For women in Victorian England, the opium epidemic was not just a matter of addiction, it was a gendered crisis that shaped their lives in profound and tragic ways. The epidemic revealed the deep-seated inequalities of a society that sought to control and regulate every aspect of women's lives. It was a crisis that not only devastated women's bodies, but also shattered their identities and their futures, leaving them to struggle against forces far greater than their addiction itself. In this sense, the opium epidemic was not just a story of personal despair, it was a story of systemic oppression, of a society that offered women little more than the false promise of relief, only to strip them of everything they held dear. Victorian medical ignorance and complicity. As the opium epidemic gripped the streets of Victorian London, the medical profession, revered for its supposed wisdom and authority, found itself at the center of a tragic paradox. The very institution tasked with healing and preserving the well-being of society was, in many ways, complicit in the destruction of its people. It wasn't that the doctors of the time were malicious or indifferent to the suffering of their patients. Rather, they were blinded by their own ignorance, their understanding of the body and mind trapped within the confines of outdated theories, and an incomplete grasp of the substances they so freely prescribed. The consequences of this ignorance were profound, particularly for women, whose struggles with addiction became a haunting reflection of the medical community's failure to grasp the true nature of the crisis unfolding before them. In the Victorian era, medical science was in a primitive stage compared to today's standards. While great strides had been made in understanding the human body, much of the prevailing medical knowledge was still based on outdated theories, such as humoral medicine, which attributed illness to an imbalance of bodily fluids, and the notion of the nervous system as a vague, unquantifiable entity. The connection between the body and the mind was poorly understood, and mental health issues were often dismissed as mere weakness or hysteria. Doctors, then, were not equipped with the knowledge necessary to recognize the addictive properties of opium, let alone the devastating impact it had on their patients. Opium, at the time, was not seen as a dangerous drug, but rather a panacea, an all-purpose remedy for a wide range of ailments. It was used to treat everything from minor pain and sleeplessness to more severe conditions like anxiety, depression, and even childbirth. The opium-based concoction, known as laudanum, was a fixture in Victorian households, found in nearly every cabinet and prescribed liberally by doctors. It was seen as a miracle cure, capable of easing the discomforts of everyday life. Doctors, many of whom had little formal education in pharmacology, relied on the reputations of such remedies without fully understanding the long-term effects. But the dangers of opium were not hidden. They were simply ignored. Medical professionals of the time, despite being in possession of the knowledge of the drug's addictive potential, either lacked the will or the tools to investigate its consequences. For most, the addiction of their patients, if they even recognized it as addiction, was not seen as a medical problem but as a moral one. In a society where self-control and discipline were paramount virtues, the idea that a person could be ensnared by something as potent as opium was unthinkable. Instead, doctors were more likely to prescribe another dose, convinced that it was the remedy for whatever ailed the patient, never considering that the cure itself might be the cause of their suffering. Women, in particular, were victims of this medical ignorance. The societal perception of women as fragile, emotional creatures in constant need of support and care meant that they were more likely to be prescribed opium-based treatments. From the constant demands of childbirth to the pressure of maintaining the perfect home, the anxiety and exhaustion of women in Victorian England were dismissed as natural elements of their existence. The use of opium to manage these symptoms, particularly for women suffering from ailments such as hysteria or nervousness, became commonplace. Doctors, accustomed to prescribing opium to their female patients, often failed to recognize that they were inadvertently laying the groundwork for a deeper, more destructive dependency. The medical profession's complicity in perpetuating the opium crisis was a slow, silent process. At first, the drug seemed to work wonders, calming the nerves, easing the pain, and offering relief where none seemed to exist. But as more and more women turned to opium for solace, the truth began to surface. Opium, far from being a solution, was a trap. Those who had relied on it to manage their ailments found themselves unable to function without it. What began as a single dose to ease a restless night or alleviate menstrual pain spiraled into a daily necessity. And yet, the medical community, despite growing signs of dependency, continued to prescribe it as a cure-all, unaware or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge the true danger it posed. This tragic ignorance didn't just affect the women who were prescribed opium. It also influenced the broader medical approach to addiction. At a time when addiction was not understood as a disease but as a moral failing, Doctors were ill-equipped to help those who had become dependent on the very substances they had once prescribed. There were no established treatments for addiction, no methods of tapering off the drug or addressing the withdrawal symptoms. Instead, patients who sought help were often left to suffer in silence, their addiction misunderstood and unaddressed. For many women, the consequences of their addiction were devastating. The very medical profession that was supposed to provide them with care and comfort was instead exacerbating their suffering. Addiction, once developed, led to a cascade of physical and psychological effects. The toll on the body was apparent: tremors, weight loss, digestive issues, and an overall deterioration of health. But the psychological effects were equally severe. Women who had become addicted to opium often found themselves in a cycle of guilt and shame. Society held them accountable not only for their addiction but also for their inability to control it. In a world that demanded moral uprightness, women who had fallen victim to addiction were regarded as failures, unable to live up to the ideals of virtue and self-control. As the years passed, a growing awareness of the opium crisis began to emerge, though it was slow to gain traction. Physicians began to notice the same patterns of dependency in their patients, particularly among women, and some began to question the wisdom of prescribing opium-based remedies so freely. But by then, the damage had been done. The addiction of thousands had been silently nurtured by a medical community too ignorant to recognize the harm it was causing. The gradual realization that medical treatments often exacerbated addiction rather than alleviating it was a painful and difficult process. It forced the medical profession to confront its own shortcomings and to acknowledge the harm it had done. However, this recognition came too late for many. Women who had been dependent on opium for years found themselves in a perilous position, with few options for recovery and even fewer resources to support their rehabilitation. And yet, despite this painful truth, the Victorian medical establishment remained largely complacent, slow to change, and unwilling to fully grapple with the consequences of its actions. In the end, the role of the medical profession in the opium epidemic was a complex and tragic one. Doctors, caught in the grip of their own ignorance and the limitations of their time, contributed to the suffering of thousands. They prescribed a substance that was as harmful as it was comforting, oblivious to the long-term consequences of their actions. Women, the most vulnerable of all, became the tragic victims of this systemic failure, their lives upended by a medical practice that neither understood nor acknowledged the addictive properties of the drugs it prescribed. The crisis of opium addiction in Victorian England was, in many ways, a crisis of medical ignorance, a failure that cost countless lives, families, and futures. The silent epidemic. The silent epidemic of opium addiction during the Victorian era was a tragedy that unfolded behind closed doors, in the dim corners of homes where families once gathered, and in the hearts of women who, behind their delicate faces, hid a battle with something far more insidious than their physical ailments. The very nature of addiction, particularly to a substance as widely used and socially accepted as opium, made it almost impossible for those suffering to speak out or seek help. The culture of silence, compounded by deep-seated stigma, shrouded the crisis in a thick veil of secrecy. It was this silence that allowed the epidemic to thrive in plain sight, particularly among the upper classes, where its devastating impact was often overlooked or dismissed as a matter of personal weakness, not public health. In a society that prided itself on maintaining an air of respectability and moral fortitude, speaking out about addiction was akin to admitting a moral failing, something that would tarnish not only an individual's character, but also the reputation of their family and social circle. To acknowledge an addiction was to acknowledge a loss of control, a breaking of the very codes of decorum and self-restraint that the Victorians held dear. For women, particularly those in the upper echelons of society. The notion of weakness, whether physical or moral, was unacceptable. They were expected to be pillars of grace and strength, upholding their duties as wives, mothers, and caretakers. The very idea of a woman addicted to opium was unfathomable to most, as it challenged the very ideals of femininity that defined her role in society. This silence, however, was not just a matter of social expectation. It was also a matter of medical ignorance and the growing normalization of opium use. Doctors, who were often as ignorant of the addictive nature of the drug as the general public, frequently prescribed opium-based remedies for ailments ranging from headaches to anxiety. It was not seen as a dangerous drug, but a necessary part of the medical arsenal. Laudanum, a tincture of opium, became a staple in homes across Victorian England. Women, in particular, who were considered more fragile and prone to emotional instability, were given laudanum to calm their nerves, alleviate the pain of childbirth, or ease the symptoms of hysteria. The drug was a quick fix, a temporary relief from the weight of their daily lives. But what started as a simple cure soon became a dependency, and that dependency grew in the shadows, hidden by the very structure of society that was supposed to protect women. The fact that addiction was not understood as a disease but rather as a personal failing, a weakness of character, made it even more difficult for those afflicted to reach out for help. In the upper classes, where appearances were everything, to admit addiction was to admit that one's carefully curated life had unraveled. The women who fell victim to the opium epidemic were not seen as victims of a widespread public health crisis. They were seen as morally weak, as women who could not handle the stresses of life, or worse, as women whose moral fiber had been compromised. They were often left to suffer in isolation, with little support from the very society that had thrust them into the circumstances that made addiction so easy to fall into. This was especially true for women of wealth and social standing. In a world where status and reputation were everything, addiction was something that could not be acknowledged. The very idea that a lady of high society could be addicted to opium was so foreign to Victorian sensibilities that it was simply ignored. When it did come to light, it was met with a mixture of pity and scorn. These women were not viewed as patients in need of medical care. They were seen as fallen women, their reputations sullied by their inability to control their desires. In a society where women's worth was often determined by their ability to maintain a certain level of decorum, the idea of addiction, particularly to a substance like opium, was anathema. To speak openly about such a thing would have been unthinkable, as it would expose not just the individual's failings, but the cracks in the very fabric of the society that claimed to be the epitome of civility and moral righteousness. As a result, many of those suffering from addiction turned inward, retreating into the silence of their own private struggles. The isolation that came with addiction was compounded by the inability to speak about it, to seek help, or even to acknowledge the severity of the problem. The silence made the addiction all the more dangerous. The more secretive it became, the more pervasive it was allowed to grow, feeding off the shame and guilt that kept it hidden in the dark. Women, particularly, were trapped in a cycle where their addiction was dismissed as an individual failing, not a public health issue. They had no recourse but to suffer in silence, their lives quietly unraveling under the weight of a substance that had been prescribed to them in good faith. But the impact of this silence extended beyond the individual. It was not just the women who suffered, it was their families, their communities, and their social circles. Addiction in the upper classes was a scandal that could tarnish an entire family's reputation. A woman's addiction to opium could result in her ostracism from her social circle, her exclusion from polite society, and the eventual collapse of her marriage and family life. The shame of addiction was not confined to the person suffering. It spread outward, infecting those around her and forever altering the course of their lives. The silence surrounding the opium epidemic allowed the drug to spread unchecked, its effects insidious and hidden beneath the facade of Victorian respectability. The more widespread the epidemic became, the more it was ignored, particularly among the wealthy. This was a class where opium use was not only tolerated, but seen as a sign of social status. Opium and its various tinctures was part of a larger network of medical treatments that were seen as essential to maintaining one's position in society. The drug was used to soothe the frayed nerves of women who were expected to meet the exacting standards of their husbands, children, and society at large. But when the drug became a necessity, it quickly turned from remedy to curse. Even as the epidemic spread, the upper classes refused to acknowledge its prevalence. In the circles of the wealthy, addiction was something that happened to the poor, to the uneducated, to those who lacked the moral fortitude to resist the allure of drugs. The very idea that addiction could infiltrate the ranks of the respectable was too much to bear. It was easier to pretend that addiction was not a problem, that it could be dismissed as an isolated issue, something that only affected those who were not part of the well-bred, well-educated elite. This denial was perhaps the most dangerous aspect of the epidemic, as it prevented any meaningful discussion of the problem, any real understanding of its impact, and any concerted effort to address the crisis. The silence, then, was not just the absence of words, it was the absence of action. It was the unwillingness of society to confront a problem that lay hidden in plain sight, lurking in the homes of the wealthy, among the people who were supposed to be the paragons of moral integrity. It was the refusal to acknowledge the suffering of those who were caught in the grip of addiction, and the failure to provide them with the support they needed to break free. The silence surrounding the opium epidemic was its own form of complicity, allowing the crisis to fester and grow, unchecked and unchallenged, until it reached a point where it was no longer possible to ignore. The real tragedy of this silent epidemic was not just the lives it destroyed, but the fact that it remained a hidden shame, shrouded in secrecy and denial, for so long. The changing attitudes toward addiction. The silent epidemic of opium addiction, which had once been ignored or quietly dismissed, began to stir the foundations of Victorian society. What had started as a crisis hidden in the shadows of parlors and drawing rooms, where upper-class women struggled with the chains of addiction, gradually evolved into something that could no longer be ignored. Slowly, a shift in attitudes began to take shape, changing how society viewed addiction and, in turn, how it was treated. No longer just a matter of moral failure or individual weakness, addiction began to be seen through a different lens, one that emphasized medical understanding and public health, rather than character judgment. This transition, however, was a gradual and painful process, fraught with misunderstandings, resistance, and shifting paradigms. For much of the Victorian era, addiction was not considered a medical condition but a moral failing. Those who succumbed to addiction were regarded as weak-willed, their lack of restraint viewed as a sign of moral decay. Society, with its firm belief in self-discipline and personal responsibility, saw addiction as a reflection of an individual's inability to conform to the standards of proper conduct. This judgment extended far beyond those who struggled with opium. In an era where public appearance and reputation were paramount, addiction to any substance, be it alcohol, opium, or otherwise, was seen as an indication of moral bankruptcy. People who fell victim to addiction were often cast aside, ostracized for their perceived lack of self-control. Doctors and medical professionals of the time, many of whom had little understanding of the complexities of addiction, mirrored this view. They prescribed opium freely, without fully understanding the long-term consequences. The drug was used to soothe the pain of childbirth, calm the anxious nerves of women, and ease the suffering of those with chronic illnesses. At the time, it was regarded as a cure-all, a remedy that offered instant relief. But for those who became addicted, it was also a prison. an invisible force that slowly tightened its grip as their dependence grew. Yet, addiction was not acknowledged as such. Patients were not seen as suffering from a disease, but from a moral failing, a flaw in their character. And so, they were treated with shame and isolation rather than compassion. This societal and medical outlook began to change toward the latter part of the 19th century. As medical science advanced and understanding of the human body deepened, new ideas about addiction started to emerge. It became increasingly clear that addiction was not merely a consequence of moral weakness or lack of willpower. Rather, it was a complex condition, influenced by both physical and psychological factors. The shift in understanding was slow, and it was not without resistance, but the foundation for a new approach to addiction was slowly being laid. The turning point came with the growing recognition that addiction was a medical issue, one that could not be solved simply through willpower or moral judgment. Doctors and scientists began to examine the physiological aspects of addiction, the way the body became physically dependent on a substance and how withdrawal symptoms could occur. The introduction of the concept of nervous diseases further fueled this shift. Addiction was now viewed as something that affected the body and mind, not just the soul. No longer could addiction be dismissed as the result of a weak character or moral failure. It was a medical condition that needed treatment and care. But while the medical community began to understand addiction more fully, society was not quick to adopt these new ideas. For many Victorians, it was difficult to reconcile the idea of addiction as a disease with the prevailing beliefs about personal responsibility and moral fortitude. After all, the Victorian ethos was built on self-reliance, restraint, and control. The notion that someone could fall into addiction through no fault of their own, or that they needed treatment and understanding, was challenging to the established worldview. The idea that addiction was a medical issue rather than a simple matter of bad choices or moral failure required a radical shift in thinking. Yet, gradually, this shift began to take hold. The first seeds of addiction treatment were planted in the late 19th century, as physicians and health professionals began to acknowledge the need for specialized care for those suffering from addiction. Rehabilitation practices started to evolve, moving away from the idea of punishment for moral failure to the idea of healing and recovery. As the medical community's understanding of addiction deepened, treatments began to emerge that aimed to help individuals manage their addiction rather than simply condemning them for their perceived lack of character. Rehabilitation, however, was still in its infancy. Early treatment methods were often crude and ineffective. The focus was primarily on managing the symptoms of withdrawal, with little attention given to the underlying causes of addiction or the psychological and emotional factors that contributed to it. The first addiction clinics were little more than institutions where addicts were isolated and treated for physical withdrawal symptoms. There were no long-term recovery programs, no psychological support systems, and no real understanding of the complex nature of addiction. It was an era still grappling with the notion that addiction was not a simple matter of choice or morality, but something that required a multifaceted approach to treatment. The process of acknowledging addiction as a medical issue also began to shift the way that society viewed those suffering from it. Instead of condemning them, there was a growing recognition that addiction was an illness that could affect anyone, regardless of social standing or character. While the stigma of addiction did not immediately dissipate, it slowly began to soften. For the first time, addicts, especially those from the upper classes, were seen as victims, not as moral failures. The more educated segments of society began to understand that addiction was not a simple case of poor choices, but the result of a combination of biological, psychological, and social factors. This shift in attitude was not just a change in how society viewed addiction, it was also a shift in how treatment was approached. By the end of the 19th century, the idea of rehabilitation had gained ground, though it was still far from perfected. Medical professionals, influenced by emerging psychological theories and growing knowledge of addiction's biological underpinnings, began to experiment with different treatment methods. Some sought to wean addicts off opium gradually, through the use of less potent drugs or controlled doses. Others focused on creating an environment of recovery, though most of these early efforts were rudimentary at best. It was clear that the road to understanding and treating addiction was still long and uncertain. The most significant change, however, was the growing recognition that addiction was not simply a matter of willpower. It was a condition that could affect anyone, regardless of their strength of character or social standing. The realization that addiction was a complex medical issue, requiring a specialized approach to treatment, laid the groundwork for the development of modern addiction rehabilitation. But it took decades of trial and error, resistance, and societal evolution before addiction treatment would begin to resemble anything close to the programs we recognize today. By the turn of the 20th century, the Victorians had, albeit slowly, begun to recognize addiction as a public health issue rather than a moral judgment. It was no longer enough to simply condemn those struggling with addiction. They needed help, understanding, and treatment. This shift in thinking was a turning point, not just in how addiction was treated, but in how society approached the most vulnerable among them. For those who had suffered in silence, trapped in the grip of opium or other substances, the changing attitudes toward addiction offered a glimmer of hope, though, for many, this hope came too late. The evolution of addiction treatment, from moral judgment to medical care, marked the beginning of a new era, an era that, while still deeply flawed, laid the foundation for the rehabilitation practices we now know, providing an understanding of addiction as a complex, multifaceted disease, rather than a simple failing of will. It was a long and painful journey, one that stretched across decades and social movements, but it ultimately paved the way for a more compassionate and scientifically informed approach to addiction. The recognition that addiction was a medical issue, rather than a moral one, was one of the most significant shifts in Victorian thought, a shift that continues to influence our approach to addiction and recovery today. The long-term effects of the opium epidemic. As the final echoes of the opium epidemic began to fade from Victorian society, the consequences of those years of widespread addiction lingered in the very fabric of society. The effects of the epidemic were far-reaching, touching every corner of life, from individual health to the structure of the family unit, and even the collective psyche of a society that had turned a blind eye to the growing crisis. In the years that followed, it became clear that the opium epidemic, which had been brushed under the rug for so long, had left a deep and lasting mark, particularly on the health of women, the stability of families, and the perception of addiction itself. The health consequences of the opium epidemic were profound, and many of these effects continued to reverberate long after the peak of the crisis. For women, the long-term impact was especially devastating. Opium had been widely prescribed to them for a variety of ailments, from anxiety and hysteria to menstrual pain and sleeplessness. At first, the drug had seemed like a miracle cure, providing relief from the daily stresses of life. But as more and more women became dependent on the substance, the consequences of their addiction began to manifest in devastating ways. Women who had been prescribed opium for legitimate medical reasons often found themselves caught in a vicious cycle of addiction. The physical toll was immense. Opium dependency led to a range of debilitating symptoms: weight loss, fatigue, tremors, digestive issues, and overall deterioration of health. The addiction itself, with its insidious grip, was difficult to escape. Withdrawal was grueling and painful, and many women who tried to stop using the drug found that their bodies had become so reliant on it that they could not function without it. For those who managed to break free, the emotional and psychological scars often remained for the rest of their lives. The sense of guilt, shame, and moral failure that accompanied addiction was difficult to shed, even when the physical dependence had been overcome. The toll on the family unit was equally profound. For many families, the epidemic represented a breakdown in the very core of domestic life. The women who had become addicted were often mothers, wives, and caretakers. Their addiction created a ripple effect that reverberated through the entire household. Children were left without the nurturing care of their mothers. Husbands were left to deal with the emotional and physical toll of their wives' dependence. And the household, which was supposed to be a place of stability, was thrown into chaos. The emotional and financial strain of addiction often led to family breakdowns, and many women were left in a state of isolation, either abandoned by their families or shunned by society for their perceived moral failings. The damage to the family unit was not just emotional, it was also financial. Opium addiction was expensive, and for many working-class families, the cost of the drug drained household resources, leaving them impoverished. In wealthier families, the financial strain was less severe, but the social stigma that accompanied addiction still cast a long shadow. Women who had once been pillars of their communities were now seen as weak and morally compromised, and their families were often ostracized as a result. The shame associated with addiction led many families to hide the problem, often keeping it secret even as it tore at the fabric of their lives. The epidemic also had a lasting impact on the public perception of addiction. For much of the 19th century, addiction had been viewed as a moral failing, a sign of weakness or a lack of character. Those who fell victim to addiction were seen as irresponsible, their lives ruined by their inability to control their desires. However, as the scope of the opium epidemic became more apparent, the perception of addiction began to shift. People began to understand that addiction was not simply a matter of personal weakness, but a complex medical issue that could affect anyone, regardless of social standing. This change in perception was slow and fraught with resistance, but it marked the beginning of a shift in how society viewed not only opium addiction, but addiction in general. The scandal of the opium epidemic, especially its impact on women, shocked the public and led to greater scrutiny of the medical profession and its role in perpetuating the crisis. The medical community had been complicit in the epidemic, prescribing opium-based remedies without fully understanding the long-term consequences. As the dangers of opium became more widely known, the government began to take action. Medical regulation increased, and laws were passed to control the sale and distribution of opium. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 was one of the first steps toward greater medical oversight, as it required pharmacists to register with the government and keep records of the drugs they dispensed. This was a direct response to the increasing awareness of the dangers of opium, and it marked the beginning of a more regulated approach to the sale and use of narcotics. Despite these initial steps, the regulation of opium and other addictive substances remained a complex issue. The demand for opium-based remedies did not immediately dissipate, and many doctors continued to prescribe opium to their patients well into the early 20th century. However, the growing recognition of addiction as a medical issue eventually led to more comprehensive reforms. The opium epidemic highlighted the need for greater medical regulation, not just in the sale of drugs, but also in the treatment of addiction itself. This shift laid the groundwork for the development of modern addiction treatment practices, including rehabilitation centers and support networks for those suffering from addiction. The long-term effects of the opium epidemic were not limited to the immediate consequences of addiction. The epidemic had a lasting impact on future generations, shaping public health policy and medical practices for decades to come. The experience of the Victorian opium crisis highlighted the need for a more compassionate, scientifically informed approach to addiction, one that recognized the complexities of the issue and the importance of medical intervention. While the immediate response to the epidemic was often slow and inadequate, The lessons learned from this crisis paved the way for more effective public health policies in the years that followed. The consequences of the opium epidemic also extended beyond addiction itself, influencing how society viewed mental health, medical treatments, and the role of women in society. The widespread use of opium and its devastating effects on women's health exposed the deep flaws in Victorian medicine and its approach to female health issues. The epidemic revealed the dangers of prescribing addictive substances without a full understanding of their consequences, and it highlighted the need for more rigorous medical standards and ethical practices. It also forced society to confront the hidden struggles of women, many of whom had suffered in silence for years, caught in the grip of addiction, unable to seek help due to the stigma and shame associated with their condition. The opium epidemic was a watershed moment in the history of addiction and public health. It marked the beginning of a shift in how addiction was understood and treated, from a moral judgment to a medical concern. It exposed the dangers of a medical system that prioritized quick fixes over long-term health and well-being, and it forced society to reckon with the hidden toll that addiction could take on individuals, families, and communities. Though the immediate effects of the epidemic were devastating, the lessons learned from this dark chapter in history helped to shape the future of addiction treatment and public health policy, laying the foundation for a more compassionate and scientifically informed approach to addiction in the years that followed. The legacy of the opium epidemic, with its long-lasting impact on women's health, the family unit, and the public perception of addiction, continues to resonate in the way we approach addiction and its treatment today. Modern reflection. The legacy of the opium epidemic. As the years unfolded and the Victorian era slipped into the pages of history, the opium epidemic faded from immediate memory, but its echoes continued to reverberate through the corridors of time. Today, addiction is recognized not merely as a moral failing, but as a complex medical issue, shaped by a mixture of biological, psychological, and social factors. The lessons from the Victorian opium epidemic, its devastating effects, the cultural stigma surrounding addiction, and the slow recognition of addiction as a disease, have all shaped modern understandings of addiction, making it a topic of both medical inquiry and social concern. The struggle against addiction, while still ongoing, has been deeply influenced by the legacy of this tragic chapter in history. And in our current battle with addiction, we continue to wrestle with the same questions that plagued Victorian society. How do we define addiction? How do we treat it? And how do we, as a society, address the stigma that surrounds it? The Victorian opium epidemic marked a pivotal moment in the understanding of addiction. For much of the 19th century, addiction was viewed through the lens of moral judgment rather than medical science. Those who fell into addiction were seen as weak-willed, morally compromised, and deserving of their fate. It was only as the full extent of the epidemic began to unfold its effects, not just on the poor, but on the women of the upper classes, on families, and on communities, that the medical community started to recognize addiction as a more complex issue. The realization that opium addiction was a medical condition, not simply a personal failure, marked the beginning of a shift that would continue well into the 20th century. One of the key legacies of the Victorian opium epidemic was the transformation of addiction from a moral issue to a public health concern. For years, those struggling with addiction were either ignored or scorned. Medical professionals, lacking the tools to understand the physiological and psychological factors of addiction, often perpetuated the problem by freely prescribing opium-based remedies. However, as the full scope of the epidemic became clear, public perception began to shift. The idea that addiction was a complex medical condition started to take root. While this shift was gradual and met with resistance, it laid the groundwork for the modern approach to addiction. Today, we no longer view addiction as a simple matter of willpower. Instead, we understand that addiction is a multifaceted condition influenced by genetic predispositions, mental health issues, social environments, and environmental factors. The medical community has come to recognize that addiction is a chronic disease, much like diabetes or heart disease, and that it requires long-term treatment and management. This shift in understanding is, in part, a legacy of the lessons learned from the opium epidemic. The Victorian era's experience with addiction highlighted the need for a more comprehensive approach, one that did not just address the symptoms of addiction, but also considered the underlying causes. The Victorian opium epidemic also had a profound impact on the way society addresses addiction in the modern world. The stigma that was attached to addiction in the 19th century has not disappeared. Rather, it has morphed and evolved over time. While there is greater recognition today that addiction is a disease, many individuals who struggle with addiction still face shame, social isolation, and judgment. This societal stigma continues to make it difficult for people to seek help, particularly among those who are most vulnerable. Just as the women of the Victorian era were silenced by shame and stigma, so too are many individuals today reluctant to reach out for help, for fear of being labeled as weak or morally corrupt. In some ways, the struggle against addiction in the modern world mirrors the challenges faced by those in the Victorian era. The fight to make addiction treatment more accessible, to destigmatize addiction, and to provide adequate care for those suffering from substance use disorders continues to be an uphill battle. The public perception of addiction, particularly in relation to drugs like heroin, continues to be fraught with moral judgment. While we have made strides in understanding addiction as a medical issue, the stigma remains a powerful force that influences policy, treatment, and the experiences of those affected by addiction. However, there are also significant differences between the Victorian era and today's approach to addiction. Perhaps the most important development has been the rise of specialized addiction treatment programs. The idea of rehabilitation, once a foreign concept, is now a cornerstone of addiction treatment. Rehabilitation programs today take a more holistic approach, recognizing the complex interplay between biology, psychology, and environment. Treatment is not just about managing withdrawal symptoms or forcing abstinence. It is about understanding the root causes of addiction and providing patients with the tools they need to rebuild their lives. The lessons from the opium epidemic, especially the realization that addiction is not merely a matter of moral failure, have influenced the development of these modern treatment models. Another important shift in the modern understanding of addiction has been the growing recognition of the role of mental health. In the Victorian era, mental health was poorly understood, and the emotional struggles of many people, especially women, were often attributed to weakness or hysteria. Today, we understand that addiction is often linked to underlying mental health issues, such as anxiety, depression, trauma, and post-traumatic stress disorder. The recognition of this connection has led to integrated treatment approaches, where addiction and mental health issues are treated simultaneously. This is another legacy of the Victorian epidemic, as it highlights the need for a more compassionate, well-rounded approach to addiction that considers all aspects of a person's health and well-being. The opioid crisis, which continues to rage across much of the modern world, can also be seen as a reflection of the lessons of the Victorian opium epidemic. While the drugs involved may have changed from opium to heroin and now to synthetic opioids like fentanyl, the underlying issues remain remarkably similar. The overprescription of painkillers, the normalization of drug use, and the lack of understanding about addiction's nature have all contributed to the current opioid crisis. Just as the Victorian era saw doctors freely prescribing opium without fully understanding its addictive properties, so too have modern medical professionals been implicated in the overprescription of opioids. The current epidemic is, in many ways, the modern echo of the mistakes made in the 19th century. But while society today is far more aware of the risks of addiction, we continue to grapple with the same issues of accessibility, stigma, and the need for comprehensive treatment. The legacy of the Victorian opium epidemic is not just a historical footnote, it is a living, breathing force that continues to shape the way we understand and respond to addiction. The lessons of the past have not been lost, but the work is far from over. Today's struggles with addiction, whether related to opioids, alcohol, or other substances, are shaped by the medical practices and societal attitudes that emerged from the 19th century epidemic. The ongoing fight against addiction in the modern world is informed by a legacy of struggle, misunderstanding, and, ultimately, progress. As we continue to push for better treatment, more effective policies, and a society that no longer shuns those who struggle with addiction, we must remember the lessons of the past. The opium epidemic, though centuries old, continues to shape the conversation around addiction today. And in that legacy, we find both a cautionary tale and a path forward. The Victorian opium epidemic, a hidden chapter in history, left a profound mark on the lives of many, particularly women, who found themselves ensnared by a drug that was, at first, seen as a remedy but ultimately became a curse. Women, often prescribed opium-based solutions for everyday ailments, were caught in a vicious cycle of dependence. What began as a treatment for minor discomforts soon spiraled into a widespread public health crisis, one that affected families, disrupted lives, and ultimately shaped public perceptions of addiction. This epidemic was not only a medical failure, but a social one, highlighting the deep inequalities and the stigma surrounding addiction, especially among the upper classes, where addiction was often ignored or masked under the weight of respectability. The epidemic's legacy is not just one of addiction, but also of a shifting societal understanding of what addiction truly is. In the Victorian era, addiction was largely viewed as a moral failing, a weakness of character. People who struggled with opium or other substances were seen as corrupt or irresponsible, particularly women, who bore the weight of societal expectations on their shoulders. Addiction was something to be hidden, shameful, and never discussed openly. And yet, as history unfolded, it became clear that addiction is far more complex than mere moral failings. It is a multifaceted medical condition with both physiological and psychological roots. The irony lies in the fact that such an enormous epidemic could remain veiled in secrecy for so long. The very nature of Victorian society, with its focus on propriety and respectability, made it difficult for individuals to speak out about their struggles. Addiction, as it turned out, was more pervasive and insidious than anyone could have imagined, especially as it was often hidden behind the veneer of well-to-do households where women secretly suffered in silence. In a society that prided itself on moral strength and control, the idea that addiction could touch those at the very heart of the social order was unthinkable. And yet, this epidemic, which quietly wreaked havoc for decades, was only fully recognized much later, after the damage had been done. History, it seems, has a way of burying its most significant crises only for them to resurface later with even greater consequences. The lessons of the Victorian opium epidemic, though learned in a time of ignorance and medical limitation, continue to echo through today's struggles with addiction. Whether we're grappling with the opioid crisis or struggling to understand the effects of addiction on modern society, we are still fighting the same battles that Victorian society faced: addiction, stigma, and the painful consequences of misunderstanding. As we reflect on the past, it's a reminder of how deeply history shapes the present. The Victorian opium epidemic may have remained hidden behind the veil of respectability, but the lessons it offers are ones we must continue to learn from. Addiction, as we now understand, is a disease, not a moral failing. The stigma surrounding it must continue to be challenged, and we must continue to build systems of care and support for those who struggle with it. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into a lesser-known historical crisis, subscribe to our channel for more explorations into strange, hidden, and often forgotten moments in history. Your thoughts are always welcome, so feel free to share your reflections on this story in the comments below. If there's another fascinating historical event you'd like us to uncover, let us know. We're always looking for the untold stories that history has left behind. And as we close, a gentle reminder: rest well. The world of history is vast and filled with strange, untold stories that continue to wait for us to uncover them.